Hi, this is George Whittam reporting for Whittam's World. Well, it's been a busy couple of weeks. Sorry I've been gone for a little while, but boy, there's been a lot of computer issues lately, and I've been dealing with a lot of emergency and support problems lately. Well, this topic comes in from Dan Harder, and it's a good one. He said, here's a topic that might help some folks experiencing noise in their audio chain. When I was in audio school, we called it gain staging. That is, having each stage of the audio chain applying the proper amount of gain and working in the design center of a particular stage of amplification and not making one stage do all the work. Example, I've discovered that my Mackie 802 VLZ3 preamps add more noise than my Vorsys M1. So I'm running a little hotter out of the M1 and have the gain, using line-in of course, on my Mackie channel turned down. Other examples of gain staging might be how much preamp gain is your interface using compared to the output gain. It's possible to get 50 decibels of gain with numerous combinations of input and output, but what is right for noise floor and driving the processing, if any, in the channel strip? Maybe this will spur other topics and questions as well. Thanks for what you do. Well, thank you for this question, because this is a doozy. So I'm going to try to answer it without going down the rabbit hole too far, and be a little, try to be concise about my response on this one. But this is a common issue for anybody that has more than one piece of equipment in their signal chain. So those of you that have opted to go the simple route and either one have just a USB microphone that already contains all of the preamp circuit, the analog digital converter, all that stuff is inside the mic. There's no gain staging to worry about because all of it's done internally. So it's totally idiot proof, quote unquote. You just set the gain correctly and you're done. Now, those of you using a microphone, a condenser mic like this one that goes into an audio interface, such as one of our favorites, the Scarlett 2i2, you really have no gain staging issues to deal with either, because your microphone goes directly into the preamp and there are no other places to change or adjust levels. So in those situations, gain staging is a non-issue. You have one knob to turn. Either it's a dial on the mic or a knob on your audio interface. Turn it up and down to set your gain. You're done. This is only going to apply to everybody else that is using a more complicated setup, which is probably a much smaller bit of you. So if this doesn't apply to you, just wait till next week or go back and look at some of the other videos in the library. But this is regarding having more equipment in the chain. In general, what he's referring to as gain staging is how much gain or volume boost is added to the signal as it travels all the way through your equipment. From microphone to mic preamp, from preamp to, say, compressor, if you have one, from compressor to a mixing console, if you have one, from mixer out back to an audio interface. All of those different stages of the signal travels through all these different stages of gain, and each one of them adds or removes some signal along the way, and in the process of doing so can add noise as well. In the case of Dan's setup, where he's using what I think is one of the most amazing mic preamp processors available today, the Vorsys M1, and he's running that into a Mackie 802. And what he didn't tell me is what the Mackie 802 is feeding into after that. So for the sake of argument in this case, or for training, let's just say it's feeding into a Scarlett 2i2. Okay? And I'll show you pictures of these and display them as I go. So what the rule of thumb here really is that you generally want most of the gain to occur at the front end. So that would be the mic and the mic preamp. That's where most of the gain should be added to the signal, because generally that's where the cleanest gain is going to be available. The mic preamp should technically have the cleanest gain and the best quality gain, because that's usually your best quality piece of equipment in the chain. And so generally I will say add most of the gain at the preamp stage. So in the case of the Vorsys, that device has an input and an output. So we're just talking about the input gain right now. So you'd want to set the input gain so that you're getting the most out of the preamp. And so that usually means, if the preamp has a meter, you should be somewhere between -12 and -6 dB or something. But generally, I usually go for that rule of thumb of hitting my meters close to 0 if it has a full range VU meter that goes up to, say, +20. And if it tops out at 0, then I want my meters to be around -12 to -6. And I'll set my gain that way accordingly. So once I have a hot level of gain, I'll set my processing settings if I'm going to use anything, such as downward expansion, compression, things like that. And then I'll have access to my output. On most preamps, there's an output and an input gain. Not all. Some of them just have a gain knob and that's it. But, if you're using a Vorsys and a Mackie mixer and a Scarlett 2i2 in your signal chain, you're going to have up to 5 or 6 places to adjust the gain. So let's keep moving down the line. So the output on the Vorsys, I generally will leave at 0. And that's because there's a calibration where you can go below 0 and above 0. I'll usually leave it at 0, which is right about a 3 o'clock position. And the reason for that is another term that Dan mentioned in his audio school days called design center of the stage of preamplification. That just basically means that there's a certain setting where the equipment will work the most optimally and really produce the least amount of noise. So that's generally going to be when the output is set to 0. So unless I have trouble somewhere else down the chain, I will usually set my mic preamp output to as close to that 0 unity or, optimal output setting that is specified by the manufacturer. From there, going into the Mackie mixer, for example, the Mackie has another gain control. There's a little dial for controlling the gain. Even when you're using an output of a mic preamp into a Mackie mixer, you are actually still going through the Mackie mixer's mic preamp. So it's very important to set its gain to the optimal setting to get the lowest amount of noise. Well, the Mackie's gain control has a little U printed right next to the knob, indicating where that unity or design center of the mic preamp actually is. So if you set it to that U setting, which is right about 10 o'clock or so, you theoretically should have the least amount of noise, and it should then be set up to take this output from the preamp with, the most optimal gain staging. Sometimes I may find myself running the gain on the Mackie a little bit lower. Maybe 9 o'clock works better. Maybe 8 o'clock works better. You just have to experiment to see how high you can set the output on the preamp without overdriving the input stage of the Mackie mixer's preamps, okay? If you put too much output at the Vorsys or at the preamp, and the input on the Mackie can't handle the signal level or the voltage, it's going to distort. So there's a certain point where you find a balance point where it's going to work the best. But I usually start with that little gain on the Mackie at U. Well, then the signal is going to travel down through the channel strip and make sure all the equalizer knobs are centered or just at the center detent position so they're not boosting or cutting EQ on any bands. And at the bottom, we have a fader control. It's either a slider or a knob, depending on which Mackie mixer you're using. In this case, it's a knob on the V802. I want to make sure my fader is optimally set at unity or 12 o'clock position. Again, that's the design center, and that's where the equipment works the most optimally with the least amount of noise. From that point, assuming now I'm going to be using the main outputs of the mixer to feed my audio interface, I'm going to also set the main mix's output to 12 o'clock as well. So there's another knob on there for main mix. I'm going to leave that at 12 o'clock if at all possible. And if it's done right with even a Mackie mixer, it's extremely low noise. Then the output of the mixer has to feed your audio interface. Depending on which interface you're using, almost all of the USB devices have their own mic preamps built in that can't be bypassed. So if you're going to, say, a Scarlett 2i2, even if you go into the little 1/4-inch jacks on the front, you're still going through the mic preamp. So again, you want to be really careful how you set the inputs on your audio device. A lot of these pieces of gear, they don't really specify where the unity gain setting is on the inputs. So it's a lot more trial and error in this case. It's going to almost always be somewhere between like 8, 9 o'clock and maybe 10, 11 o'clock, somewhere in that range where you set the gain knob is where you're going to get the closest to a unity setting. You might find you can set the gain knob on your audio interface to its minimum, all the way down as far as it'll go, and you'll be able to drive that input. But you have to be careful because some devices just can't handle that much output and could clip. So depending on your setup, you might find you have to run the output of your preamp or your mixer a little lower to compensate. Every piece of equipment is different. Again, you got to use your ears and do a little experimenting, but that's the rule of thumb. So basically, you want the most gain at the front, the least amount of gain at the back end, and you want everything along the way to be as close to that design center or unity setting as possible. So I always start with my levels on my mixers set at unity, not full volume, not halfway down, but at that unity setting to get the best possible results. And then if I need to make minor adjustments on the fly, I'll be able to do that. That's what the fader's for. If I'm in the middle of a session doing ISDN and the studio says we need more level, I'll just turn my level up a little bit more and give them what they want. And when I'm done, center it back to unity for the best sound quality. So there you have it. That's a long description, but it's not a simple subject, and I hope I was able to boil it down to the basics here that you guys could understand in conjunction with the little graphics I was able to throw on screen for you, hopefully. If you have a question, and we've got a lot of them in the queue, so I'm going to be mowing through them as fast as I can, but if you do have a question you'd like to have answered on the show, please do send it in to whittamsworld@edgestudio.com, and I will try to answer it in a future episode. If you just can't wait for me to answer it on the show, and you really need one-on-one support, then please do visit me over at vostudiotech.com. Click on the Get Support button at the top, or try one of the services in the service menu where I can help you out in a manner of different ways. It's been my pleasure to share this with you this week. My name's George Whittam, and I'll see you next time on another Whittam's World. Thanks for watching.